All right, shalom everybody, and welcome to Translating Hebrew, week number 1. So, we have gone through beginning, intermediate, and advanced Hebrew, and if this is your very first time watching any Hebrew on this live stream, all of those classes you can find on YouTube at the Passion For Truth video channel. Look on there and you'll see it says something like Biblical Hebrew class with Mark Jacob. Find that. You can go through beginner, which goes through the alphabet and vowels, intermediate, which goes through the grammar, and advanced, which covers everything up to current day. And we're going to use the tools we have from those classes to start translating a few scriptures. So I don't have anything. There will be a page called Translating Hebrew up on the regathering. The page is there, but it's blank right now because I don't know how far we're going to get each week. So once I have a better beat on that, I'll have some notes that'll go along with this. In the meantime, I hope that you online can read this. The verse for the day is Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. I have a few spare Hebrew Bibles there if you want to follow along there. It's up on the board too. But yes, Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2 is where we're going. A little bit of cleanup. I realized that in week 7 of the advanced class, I was talking about numbers, and this is a minor thing. Most people probably didn't remember it anyway, but I want to correct it because I made a mistake. The term Rishon, which means first, does not have a form called Rishonit. Rishonah would be the feminine form. All the others have the Yod Tav It form at the end to make them feminine in the ordinal numbers, so second, third, fourth, and so on. Okay, Sheni is the masculine, Shenit is the feminine, Shlishi is the masculine, Shlishit is the feminine. Rishon is an exception. Okay, Rishon does not have a Rishonit form, so I just want to cover that because I did mention that. That is not the case. Okay, Rishon stands alone. All right, so with that out of the way, here we are at Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. And so the first thing, we'll just start with verse 1. The first thing I want to do is actually pronounce the whole verse. Okay, read it, pronounce it, just so you know what we're looking at. So starting here, we've got Bereshit, bara, Elohim, et hashamayim, ve'et haaretz. All right, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. So, we'll start at the very beginning. By the way, Bereshit is the first word of Genesis, and in the Hebrew Bible, the name of the book Genesis is Bereshit. This is a theme you'll find throughout the books of the Torah. Either the word at the very beginning or one of the first 2 or 3 words in the book will be the name of the book. So at the beginning of the beginning, we have Bereshit, which means beginning. Now, I'm going to get a little deeper into that. First off, I haven't covered the word Reshit in our vocabulary, but there's some things you can point out, even without knowing your vocabulary, that you can deduce right away about this word. First off, it starts with a bait, with a shva underneath it. That is a dead giveaway that this is your prepositional prefix bait, which means in or with. It's not part of the root of the word. Okay, so we know that our first idea expressed here is in or with. All right, then we have the rest of this word, Reshit. Okay, a few other things we can deduce from this. This it ending you'll find on a lot of words. It's an ending, it's a suffix. It doesn't usually incorporate the root of the word. So the root of this word, these 3 radicals right here, resh, aleph, and sheen. We do know that word. I did cover that in vocabulary. It's rosh, and it means head. Now, as we go about translating this, okay, we can understand head in context of some other scriptures, just rosh, not reshit, but rosh by itself. Rosh means head. It can also mean first in a sense. There are phrases like Rosh Chodesh, which means first of the month. The term Rosh Hashanah, which you won't find in Scripture, but is a valid Hebrew phrase, would mean head of the year. It means the first day of the year. Okay, Rosh Chodesh means the first day of the month. And then we also know our word Rishon, okay, Resh Aleph Shin Vav Nun, which, as I mentioned in week 7, means first, numerically first. So what is the business with this Reshit? Now, if you look up Reshit and see, and this is a key thing to do when translating, is when you're translating a particular verse and you want to know what a particular word means, look at how that word is used in other verses. That'll give you a good sense of context. And Reshit is used in a number of verses and the root of it is Rosh, so we know it has something to do with the head of something. But this isn't Rishon, so it doesn't mean first. It's Reshit. A lot of the applications of Reshit are in terms of first fruits, or if you look in context, it usually means either the first of or the best of something. So the Reshit is typically translated in the beginning, okay, at the start. I would actually make an argument, for the sake of translating it into colloquial English, to translate Bereshit, okay, in the best, in the first, okay, to translate that first of all, because that's kind of what it's indicating. Most importantly, or the first thing you need to know is what's about to follow, okay? So in the first or in the best, all right, inadequate translations, I would venture for first of all, in the beginning is just fine in context, seeing what's about to transpire in the rest of Genesis 1. But my argument would be first of all. Okay, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but that seems to fit the context of Reshit very well to me when you look up the other places it's used. Okay, but the idea here is an introduction. Okay, here's the beginning. All right, bara. Again, we haven't had this in our vocabulary, but what you can note about this, we've got 3 letters. Our last letter is an aleph. We've got a comments vowel, comments vowel. That fits a particular pattern. If you look in your conjugation sheet, all right, for your lamed aleph conjugation in the pa'al, this is the third person, masculine, singular, past tense. The root, beit resh aleph, means to create. So, past tense, created. Third person is he or she or they. Singular means it's got to be either he or she, and masculine means it must be he. Okay, it narrows down just like that. It fits the pattern. Okay, first radical comments, second radical comments, ends with an aleph. Okay, so bara, he created. All right, Elohim, of course we know is God. And, all right, so we've got Elohim as the subject of the verb bara. So in the beginning, he created God. No, not a good translation. Okay, we've got to make sense of it to put it into English first. We can't rely on the Hebrew word order. Okay, so in the beginning, God created. All right, now how do we know that Elohim is the subject of the verb? Because there's other nouns that follow. Et. Et means whatever follows is the direct object of this sentence. Okay, that's our sign of the accusative, aleph tav with the segel. Hashamayim.
Before you run when you say you came through Bereshit and you hit Bara, third person, and then you hit Elohim, and my my mind is going, Elohim. We say God, but could it be just powers, plural powers? And then when you say the third person, to me, you're saying the Ruach is the one. And it's just the way my mind is running. So like I told you, I'm going to sit here and be quiet.
No, questions are very important because you mentioned Elohim. Does that have to be God? Could it just mean powers? Because sometimes Elohim is translated that way, as powers or judges, mighty ones.
But you know it's a singular entity because
you
of
did
the verb.
the barra with the third person.
We know that because bara is singular and Elohim is the subject,
With three different identities.
Elohim must be singular, even though it has the im ending. Because if you look on your conjugation chart, there is a third person plural. It would be bar-u. They would say bar-u if this was meant to be plural. All right? The laws of grammar, the rules of grammar. Laws only apply to other studies. Rules apply to grammar. The rules of grammar rather prohibit us from translating this gods. Absolutely prohibited. Okay, the scribes would have remembered to put that vav there. Okay? They absolutely would have remembered that. So this must be singular in this verse. And that's why we know that it's singular. That's the only way we know it's singular. If it weren't for that, we wouldn't know. Okay, but we know that we must match our number of our subject with the number of our verb. Okay? And so that is why the translation God is accurate. Okay, even though Elohim in other contexts could potentially be plural. All right? Now, how do we know that it's God doing the creating and not the one being created? It's because of the position of et. If we had et Elohim, we would know that in the beginning something else created God. But that can't be the case because et is not before Elohim, it's after. But more importantly, what's after et? Hashamayim. Okay. So again, looking at this word, we can immediately see, it starts with a hey patach. That's our giveaway that we've got the definite article. Okay? So created the Shamayim. How many which? Oh, how many heavens? Shamayim, properly speaking, is in the dual form. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's either singular, plural, or dual. Okay, because mayim is also in the dual form. Yes, but shamayim, I believe I covered that in the vocabulary. I'm pretty sure I did. And if I didn't, most people who know a little bit of Hebrew have heard about shamayim at some point because it means heavens or heaven or sky, depending on the context. Okay, we think of heaven as being sort of like a otherworldly kind of place, and the sky is too, for that matter, because we don't. Up until 100 years ago, we never went there. But anyway, the heavens or the heaven or the sky. Okay, ha-shamayim. Why is there a dagesh in this sheen? That's right, because the sheen is preceded by the definite article. Okay, just a little grammar quiz there that's going way back to intermediate. Yes, ha-shamayim. Drag out the sh a little bit in the pronunciation. Okay, so we've got in the beginning, or first of all, Elohim created the heavens, or the skies. Okay, which one we're going to use kind of depends on context. In Hebrew, thought it's the same thing, so not too much of a problem there. But in English, it kind of makes a difference because we associate different things with the sky than we do with heaven in our English thoughts. Again, great reason to go back to the Hebrew. You don't get confused about anything like that. There's no additional, unless you read a lot of rabbinic writings, no additional theological baggage that goes along with particular words. Okay. So, yes, I personally opt for sky being used here. Right. It makes a little more sense. A lot of the scriptures are written from our perspective as human beings. And so... sky is good. Heavens is actually okay, though, for another reason, but that's because of other ways that this verse applies to other verses. But that's a theological question that I'm not going to get into right now. Okay. So next we have the et. Again, we know we've got a prefix because we've got a vav at the beginning. All right, it wouldn't matter what vowel was under that vav. We'd be pretty sure that we're dealing with a vav prefix. Okay? So in the beginning, God created the heavens and et. And what? Well, whatever comes after the et. So we've got two objects for this sentence. All right, we've got one verb, right, one subject, and now we've got two objects, and each object is being pointed out by the preposition et. All right, so this is, if you start constructing sentences and you've got multiple objects, this is the proper form, okay? Et x, the et y, the et z, the et whatever you want, okay? Haaretz. Okay, again, we've got a hey starting, so we should immediately start thinking definite article. Why is there a comments under this hey?
Because it comes before an aleph.
That's right, because it's the definite article that comes before an aleph.
An aleph can't take a dagesh, so it has to be take a comment.
That's exactly right. So remember, if you go way back to our definite article rule, the aleph, the ayin, and the resh cannot take a dagesh. So when the hey appears before them as the definite article, or when any definite article appears before those three letters, instead of taking a patach, it takes a comments. The dot from the dagesh dot moves down and becomes the bottom of the comments. Okay? Now, here's another funny thing, though, and I don't know if I talked about this. The word for land or earth is eretz, okay? Aleph resh tzadi with segel. This says aretz, and I've mentioned this before, but I don't know if I really made a point of explaining it. There are certain words who, when they take the definite article, they actually have a vowel change within the word. So this is nothing really unusual here. It's just eretz, when it takes the definite article, becomes aretz. I'm not sure exactly why that is. There's just a select number of nouns that will do that. Okay? So we would think ha-eretz, but this is just an irregularity where eretz becomes aretz. So this is correct. And yeah, it is easier to pronounce ha-aretz than ha-eretz. It's a little less of an awkward stop. So that may be the reason. I don't know why exactly, but whatever the case. So in the beginning, God created, object of the sentence 1, the heavens, and second object of the sentence, the earth. Okay? Another just interesting note, just as an aside, and I'm not going to get into theological implications of this, if indeed there are any. You note we've got the definite article in front of the heavens. He didn't just create any heavens, just thought the heavens, like the ones we're familiar with. And the earth, as in the earth, the one we know about. There's no definite article here at the beginning. It doesn't say in the beginning, it says in Reshit. Okay, I'm not saying this wasn't the beginning, okay? But for some reason, it says Bereshit instead of Bareshit. Remember, if we had the definite article, it would combine with our bait prefix. So we'd have the bait with a patach underneath it. Okay, we'd have the consonant of our one prefix and the vowel of our definite article. So, but it doesn't say Bareshit. Actually, we'd have a comments here, not a patach, because it precedes a resh. But we don't have that. We have a shva. It says Bereshit. Okay. I really doubt that they got the vowels wrong in Genesis 1.
Not even for theological purposes?
I don't know what theological purposes they would have for changing that vowel either.
Well, you could say it was all in his head.
I don't know.
The answer lies in number 2.
But again, I don't want to particularly get into the theological implications of that. I think that the sense, first of all, is the sense in which it's meant to be taken, and that's one reason that I think the definite article is not there. So you're not thinking of this chronologically, but thinking of this in terms of priorities. Like, hey, first off, God made this place. All right, is kind of the really colloquial way of saying what's being expressed in this verse. There's more to it, of course. Okay.
What about the hidden olive?
I don't see the hidden olive, so
Just saying, so many people teach a hidden olive.
yeah, so there's plenty of theological things we could discuss, like why does the Torah begin with a bait instead of an olive? My answer is why wouldn't it? But if it was, I don't see why it would need to start with an olive. None of the other books start with an olive. So, but anyway, so I will leave that for you all to ponder why that is a shva instead of a comets. Okay, but I just wanted to point that out because I didn't point it out right up front. Okay, so that's Genesis 1:1. Any questions, comments about Genesis 1:1? Anything not clear about how the rules are functioning, or
The olive's in the one. What?
what's that?
The olive is in the one.
Is in the one?
Oh,
The number
the
one.
number one you drew in front of the verse thing. You're saying the
That's the
olive
olive.
is in
Oh, yes.
that. It's giving you more olive trouble.
Sorry, there's
Yeah.
just a lot of people out there that are drawn.
Inside gematria joke he was mentioning there. So, all right. So that's Genesis 1:1. So now we move on to verse 2. And the verse divisions, of course, came after the text was written. They weren't there in the. If you look in an old scroll, there are no such verse divisions, but they do. The reason the verses were divided the way they were is because they do form sort of logical compartments. They're kind of meant to end sentences in a way, although sometimes they actually end paragraphs. So, but in any case, they do divide ideas one from another. And I mean, I'll talk about why we know that verse 2, it should be considered separate from verse 1, like we shouldn't just keep reading verse 1 into verse 2. So, but it is its own thing here. All right, so first, right. All right, first term in verse 2, v'ha'aretz. Okay, now we know we're moving on to something different here because we're out of etz, right? If we were still talking about things God was creating, all right, still continuing this sentence, all right, we'd need another et here. We wouldn't need to be jumping into something totally different. All right, so there's no et, we're on to something new. Okay? All right, again, vav prefix. So we know and, or, vav can be translated a number of different things. And is the most basic, but in English we wouldn't necessarily say and, every time there's a vav. Sometimes now or yet or some other conjunction would be more appropriate for our understanding of the text. But the vav has many, many uses, and but it both connects and it divides. Here it's dividing. It's connecting verse 1 to verse 2, but it's also indicating a stopping point, like, okay, next idea. All right?
It's joining the ideas.
Yeah, so it joins the it sews the narrative together, but it also makes sense of it, compartmentalizes it. Okay?
Bible is a piece of carpentry.
Yes. Yes, it is. Hebrew text is woven together, no doubt about it. And the vav is indeed the nail or the needle, okay, that sews the different things together. So we've got v and, okay, haaretz again. We just saw haaretz, so that's the earth. Okay, so and the earth, haita. Now I covered this last week. Our verb haya, all right, which means to be, or hey yud hey is our verb for to be. This is the past tense, third person, feminine singular. She was. what haita means. Why haita and not haya? Because eretz is feminine. Yes, lands would be eretz sot. Okay, but eretz is in fact feminine. So haita, and the earth or the land was. And now we have a real funny part. We've got this phrase here, tohu vabohu, or vavohu. There's no dagish in this bait. So we know this vav is an and. But there's something funny you should notice right away. Eretz is feminine, so the earth was tohu vabohu. This is not in the feminine form. Neither of these are in the feminine form. So whatever these are, it doesn't seem like they're adjectives. If they're adjectives, they should end with a comma, hey, just like every other singular feminine adjective, right? But it doesn't. And this is a funny little phrase here, and I did a little research on this because I've wondered about this myself. Like, why this tohu vabohu business? If you look up these terms, tohu is used about 10 times total in the scriptures. Bohu is used only 3, and it's always used with tohu. In the phrase tohu vavohu, actually when I was doing a little Google search on this, Google's amazing, an entire word called tohu vavohu, okay, is a word in several different languages.
Really?
Yes. There's a band named that, actually. And the translation in these other languages means basically chaotic, or crazy, or, confusing, or a brouhaha, okay, would be the...
So, haita is only translated as was.
Yes.
She was.
Because I'm going like,
Yeah.
and my, I had it as became, not
Okay,
was.
now this is a good... I will actually get back to that, because there's an important distinction to be made about that. Was and became. No, that's an excellent comment, because there are scholars who talk about this, who talk about whether haita should be was, or whether it should be became. She became. And there's, I think, an important reason that we should call it was. Okay?
And I think it's one reason that we should say became.
And other scholars do too, but I think that...
Back up at number 1 and you say, this is not the real beginning, this is like another beginning.
And that's the only reason, though, to think that this should be became. There's other good reasons to think it isn't.
Right.
So I do want to address that, because that's very important to the understanding of the chapter.
If this was after the apple, it would be probably became.
Well, I mean, theologically speaking, Genesis 1 is very interesting because it's sort of it's kind of a template for beginnings. There's a number of beginnings that happen in the Bible that follow patterns very similar to the way this is described. So it's kind of like history repeating itself a lot. All right, so the pattern that the world came into existence by is the pattern where other kinds of beginnings originate as well. And I'm going to talk... I don't want to get too much into that because that's its own thing. I want to focus more on the grammar. But that's a cool little thing about Genesis 1 that a lot of people don't really appreciate.
So it has a band in the middle of it.
Yeah. But anyway, so moving back to our tohu vabohu. Again, adjectives don't seem to work because this is not feminine. Well, when you look up, there's a couple things you can look up. With reshit, we have dozens of examples of reshit being used elsewhere in the scriptures. So we have a lot of good context to go on to figure out what reshit means. Tohu vavohu, we only have 3 instances of vohu. It's always used with tohu. Okay, so that doesn't help a whole lot. And tohu, you can kind of get a sense looking up the other There's other uses that it means kind of barren is a basic idea. There's a number of other ways you could go with that, but barren's kind of a good one. But again, even 10 isn't that many examples to go on. One thing that biblical scholars will do, and this is where archaeology actually plays a big part in biblical interpretation, is when we've got words like this that are kind of obscure, what they'll do is they'll look at texts that are written in other Semitic languages, ancient Semitic languages. Because all the nations that are mentioned in the Torah, like all the Canaanite nations, okay, Abraham came out of Ur of the Chaldees, the Chaldeans, okay. Yes, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, they're all in this area in the Middle East. And they're trading with each other, they're communicating with each other. And the Hebrews in particular, okay, Abraham's line, man, they traveled all over the place. They went all over the Middle East. If you follow Abraham's journey and you track that out, I mean, Abraham went a long, long way in his life, went all the way down to Egypt. So he interacted with a lot of different cultures. And, these people all kind of knew who each other were. And their languages all had a lot of similarities. Arabic is actually very similar to Hebrew as well. So when they find, archaeologically, they find these texts from these other cultures that date back a few thousand years, okay, so we're back into the biblical Hebrew time frame, they will find a lot of words that are similar to Hebrew words. And so that gives a broader base. Now, what it means in those languages doesn't necessarily reflect on what it means in Hebrew. But if you have at least more to go on, you can get a better guess at what these things might mean.
Doesn't it just mean marking the revelation of the man?
Not exactly. And now you have to be careful with that, though, because what some scholars will do is they'll find things like this, and one of the popular themes for interpreting tohu vavohu is they connect it to, there's this Ugaritic is an ancient Semitic language, and there's a text in Ugaritic that has this story about Yahweh fighting with a dragon. Okay? And so there are similarities between that story and Genesis 1. Okay? Similarities in that some of the same words, or there are words that are similar between Hebrew and Ugaritic, and some of those are used in the Ugaritic text and also in Genesis. Okay, so they say, okay, these are related somehow. And for some reason, the bias of scholars is to say that the Hebrew came from all these other texts instead of all these other texts drew influence from the Hebrew. What logical basis they have to assume that directional arrow, I have no idea. Other than to try to say that the Hebrew text isn't original, because I don't know why. But scholars who dig a little deeper don't tend to have that view. They tend to just say, okay, these are aids for interpretation. Which one came from which, there's no way of knowing. Or if they came from each other at all, we don't know. But you look a little deeper, though, and the Arabic actually uses some terms that are very, very close to these, and they use them together. Okay, so it's kind of part of the same phrase. And so anyway, all that being said, you dig into this a little further, and the phrase tohu vavohu, tohu basically means barren, okay, lifeless, and vohu is empty. But as I mentioned, though, these don't really look like adjectives. And I think that it would be better to say something like a wasteland, okay, a desert, a barren place, and an empty place. Okay, rather than use them as adjectives, use them as nouns. Because if they were adjectives, they would really need to be feminine to modify eretz, and they're not. So the earth was a wasteland and an empty place. Okay, no life. No nothing. No anything, I should say. No nothing would mean there was something. So, Okay? So that is as scholarly as I'm going to get with this. Okay, the rest of it all follows from what we've already learned. Sometimes you do have to do a little digging to figure out these things, and I'm not saying that that's the end-all answer. That's just the best guess given all of the resources that I've been able to encounter. And there are scholars who have a connection to a lot more resources than I do, okay? So don't take my word for it, but that is just, I can say just from a grammatical point of view, these don't look like adjectives because they're not in the feminine form. They don't end in comma te. And every feminine singular adjective ends in a comma te. So why that would be different right here, I couldn't imagine. So I really think these should be interpreted as nouns. Okay? Any other commentary on that? All right. Okay, so the earth was a wasteland, an empty place. V'choshech. Again, we've got our vav at the beginning. So and. Choshech is darkness. Okay. And darkness. All. All is our preposition. That means on or over or above. Most translations say upon. Now, and darkness upon doesn't work, right? That doesn't make any sense. Usually we would say is, and darkness is upon whatever comes next. That doesn't work here either, though. The reason that doesn't work is because we're talking in the past tense. We've got haita right here. Okay, the earth was a wasteland and an empty place. Darkness is upon something. We're jumping tenses. Yes. One of the things, though, about Hebrew narrative is they don't jump tenses. They continue the tenses.
Just a different tense within the tense.
Right. And so on that note, I'm going to jump back over here before I continue forward with this. But this haita, this was, has to carry through until it's negated by some other form of haya. All right, we talked about this with the vav flipping. When the vav inverts the tense of a verb, it will always flip future to past, but whether it flips past to future depends what tense you were already talking in. If you've been talking in the past the whole time, the vav in front of a past tense verb keeps it in the past. But if you were talking in the future, the vav in front of the past tense verb flips it to the future. Whatever tense you were talking in, you're going to stay in, right? Unless you have something that's specifically, okay, a specific form here that says, hey, we're changing course now. And we haven't seen anything to say we're changing course. So was is actually, even though there's not a haya there, is the appropriate translation. Okay? So it's actually an invisible was. It's an invisible is, but it's an invisible was. Okay.
Is it really invisible?
It's quite invisible. There's nothing there. Okay. So, all right. So by saying was, we're just continuing the narrative's progression. All right. So darkness was upon, or on, or over. All right. Context will determine that. Pene. Pene, if we remember our word panim, which means face, pene is panim in the construct state. Okay? Our im will change to a. Even though panim isn't technically a plural word, it could be faces, but it can also be face, singular. But whenever it's made in the construct state, it takes on the construct form of pene. Just like bene means sons. Okay, pene is on the face of our invisible word because we're in the construct state. Tehom. Tehom means the deep. All right, again, this is some of these words I haven't covered, but some I have. You remember Aretz, Elohim, Shemayim, Et. Okay, Haya. You're always going to encounter additional vocabulary when you start translating things. Tehom you can look up if you wish to verify that, but it means deep, kind of in the sense of the bottom of the ocean or the bottom of a sea, a lake. Okay, so darkness was upon the bottom or the deep, the face of the deep.
Still is darkness at the face of the deep.
There is indeed.
Boiling water, too.
Okay. The ruach and
And is the wind.
ruach, right, and spirit or wind. Hebrew, it's the same thing. Ruach. Ruach Elohim. The ruach of Elohim. Okay, now, should we translate this wind or should we translate it spirit? That's a question.
This is breath.
Okay. Now, I don't think it makes much difference as long as you know that the original word is ruach. Okay, because I think it, whichever sense you want to take it in, ruach is, of course, appropriate.
Such a great wind in other places.
But either the wind of God or the Spirit of God. All right. Mirachefet. Now this is kind of funny. We've got a mem at the beginning, but it's got a shva underneath it. If this mem was from, it would have either a chirik or a tzera. But it's got a shva, so we know it's not the prepositional prefix from. If you remember our conjugation of the PL, binyan PL, the present participle, okay, singular masculine form is mem with a shva, the feminine singular form, mem with a shva, first radical with a patach, second radical segol, third radical segol, and ends with a tav. By the way, if you watched live last week at the Advanced Hebrew Week 8, those notes are, I don't have them printed out yet, but those notes are up at the regathering where you'd normally find them. So you've got that whole list there if you want to follow along and see that for yourself. This is the present tense binyan PL. Now, again, present tense, why is that here when we're talking about the past? Well, it's another reason that it's not really the present tense. It's the present participle. And continuing with our was idea, the Ruach Elohim was, whatever this is, and then end in ing. All right, what is this word before we go too much further? We know it's singular, we know it's feminine, and we know it's the present participle form. If you look up the root here, resh, chet, pei, okay, it means to flutter. King James says hover. A lot of translations will say something to that effect. Translations that translate ruach as wind will say something like was blowing over. Okay? But if you look up where this word is used, I think flutter as in a bird is a little more appropriate. When you look at other instances of the Ruach Elohim being over water, cough, cough, the baptism of Yeshua, you'll note the Spirit of God coming down as a bird. All right.
Some theological stuff here.
So that's all I'm going to say, but this fluttering, okay, seems to be,
What if it was an unclean bird?
it was a dove.
No person out an unclean bird, though.
Okay, so this idea of the Spirit fluttering is there, but again, this is the PL form, so it's an intensive fluttering, right? So this is really stirring whatever it's over.
Is that why he's sweeping?
Why does it have to be feminine?
Because it's referring to Ruach.
Because the subject is ruach, which is feminine. Okay, so this is following all of our rules. We've got a feminine verb for our feminine subject. All right. So, all right, I'll finish this out and then I'll get back to the haita. All right, fluttering upon, another al. Pene, face of. Hamayim.
The water.
the waters or the water.
Plural.
Okay? Definite article and then our term mayim, which means water. Now, okay, why does the mem have a dagish? Because it follows the definite article. Why is mayim spelled with a kametz when it's normally spelled with a patach?
Because it's following the other part of the part.
It actually, there's no good reason for that. There is a reason for that, but I haven't taught it yet because it's crazily complicated.
Because it has a dash.
If you're wondering what in the world's going on here, if you're getting that technical into the vowels and things, sometimes at the end of a verse or halfway through a verse, certain vowels will lengthen in words.
So you can sing them better.
It's kind of a crazy thing. It is somewhat consistent. So if you've gone through all the classes, you've gotten this far, and you've wondered why I haven't zoned in on the technicalities of vowel changes and all that, it's because they're crazy. There are so many of them to try to keep track of. And so that's why I just say, just know that these vowels will change sometimes. All right? So, but anyway, if you did notice that mayim is normally spelled with a patach, and here it's spelled with a kametz, it's because, for whatever reason, in this particular case, that's the appropriate thing to do. All right? There's not a particular grammatical rule that it follows. It's just at the end of a verse, sometimes words will do that. I don't know why. All right? But I do know that is the logic there. So, going back over the whole thing, and the earth was a wasteland and an empty place. Darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit, or the Ruach, just call it the Ruach if you wish, of Elohim was fluttering on the face of the water.
Quick question.
Yes.
You say the Spirit, but I don't notice that definite article.
Quite right. I said the Spirit, but there's no definite article. That is just for English sake.
Bad translation.
Because if I said, and a Spirit of Elohim, and that is actually, because of the lack of the definite article, that is why some translations opt to go with wind. Rather than say the Spirit of, they say a wind from, or a wind of God was fluttering over the face of the waters. I don't think that's consistent with other uses of the term Ruach Elohim, all right, throughout the rest of the scriptures, okay, because it does seem to be sort of a specific thing when you look into it like that. So, and I like to keep things consistent between, different scriptures, especially different scriptures listed in the exact same book.
So he's got words coming out, generating wind with his mouth and all this stuff.
Right. Right. So, in grammatical context, it seems to make sense to refer to this as just a general wind. But in context of so many other scriptures, it seems like we should almost think of it as having the definite article even though it doesn't. But that is true. Technically, there is no definite article here, just like there's no definite article here. Okay? And in this case, it can't even be just a vowel switch because the vav does not combine with the definite article. You'd have to have a whole nother hey to do that. Just an aside, if it did have the definite article, that actually would appear before Elohim. Because this is a construct phrase, okay, Spirit of Elohim. So the definite article would go in front of the second word, not in front of the one in the construct state. Okay, but in either case, it's not in either place. Yes, that's right. That's why it's Ruach HaKodesh, Spirit of Holiness. Okay, the Spirit of Holiness.
It's not the Ruach.
Right, it's not HaRuach HaKodesh. Okay? So, and the Spirit or a wind, okay? Which way it goes, hey, you gotta look into it. Just in context of the story being like a literal narration of the creation, wind would seem to be appropriate. It's talking about all these other things that are pretty straightforward, land and sky and, water and deep and, well, a wind. Why not? Right? Why would we insert a spirit here all of a sudden? But in light of other scriptures, I would actually argue for spirit. That's why going back to the Hebrew is so significant, though, because it actually could just mean a general wind here, but still be connected to these other verses by the fact that they use the word ruach. Okay, so there's deeper implications here than just a story about how the world came to be. All right. So, going back to Haitah, why am I saying that the earth was tohu vabohu instead of the earth became tohu vabohu, as in it was something else before, but it became a wasteland and an empty place? Now, this is a translation that is opted for by people who, first off, note that there's not a definite article here, so maybe this isn't the first beginning, as it were. This is a recreation. And so the idea is, well, maybe there was this earth that was perfectly fine before, but it became this wasteland and this empty place. When you look further and see these other texts that talk about, that seem to be related, that talk about this fight with the dragon, all right? So maybe that caused the earth to become this, and then, you just go from there. The pieces seem to fit. But there's a reason that they don't. And it's almost like the author intentionally wrote this in a way that you couldn't do that. And I'm going to explain what I mean in a moment. We talked about the vav that inverts. Now, the vav doesn't necessarily the vav does invert. If we were to say, as I mentioned, when you put the vav in front of a future tense verb, it makes it past tense. There's a big question about that, which is why? Why would we have two ways of expressing the past tense? Why would we have two ways of expressing the exact same thing? Why wouldn't we just keep the past tense in the past, keep the past in the past, right? Keep the future in the future, and the vav just means and. Why can't we just have it straightforward like that? One possibility, and one thing that is advocated by a number of scholars, is that the vav, when you put the vav in front of a word, it is actually its own form. So vav in front of future tense isn't really a vav in front of future tense. It's a special form of the past tense, and it should be interpreted a little bit differently. The difference, they say, in interpretation is that when it's just a straight past tense, it just means past tense. It just was, and that's the way it was. But with the vav in front of the future tense, it means became. It indicates a process, which is why that and is in front of it. It's a continuation through. All right, so it's not just, it was that way statically, but it became that way in a dynamic sense. Places where that's used, usually, sometimes a vav future tense starts a sentence, but it usually comes in the middle of a sentence. And so it's like just continuing through what's going on, but became this, became this, became this. Okay. What we note, though, is that instead of putting the vav in front of a future tense haitah, which would be vatihiyeh, if you remember your haya conjugation, vatihiyeh would also mean and she was. So we could have vatihiyeh haaretz, okay? And that you could make a case for meaning she became, the earth became. But we don't have that. It's unusual to have a sentence that starts with a noun, and then we have our verb. Up here, we start with a verb. We start with our preposition, right, setting the stage. All right, but we've got verb, subject, object. I mentioned this many times before in class. That's the normal order of a Hebrew sentence. Verb, subject, object. Whenever you have something out of that order, it's meant to draw your attention to the first word.
Because he created two earths. And it really belongs in sentence 2. That's the answer.
Yes, and we can get to the truly bizarre for figuring out why this emphasis is here. But this is emphasizing the earth.
You just solved the problem.
Okay? It's emphasizing the earth, and it's intentionally not affixing the vav to the verb. So it's almost as if to say, okay, beginning, created the heavens and the earth. Now we're going to talk about the earth. Okay? So, was seems to be better. And it's not that became isn't possible, because it could be, even if it says was, that doesn't mean it couldn't mean that it became that way from something else. Okay, so I'm not eliminating that option theologically, but I'm saying that that option is not supported by evidence in the grammar. Okay, there's nothing about the grammar of these verses would allude to anything different than what we normally interpret this to mean. And that's why it's translated this way 95% of the time. And the people who want to translate it differently, it's usually because they want to connect it to these other stories. Okay? I'm not saying that they're wrong, but I'm saying that the grammar itself doesn't lend an idea to that. Thank you. Okay? So, now, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Okay? So that's a different argument than the argument that Elohim is singular. That is for sure. Okay? That is absolute because it has to follow this rule. Okay? I'm not saying for sure, all right, that this means was and there's no option for anything before. Although I would argue, okay, this is just my 2 cents theologically, that the sense of bereshit, meaning instead of saying bereshon, instead of saying that kind of first, they say reshit, which always points to the best or the most important thing. That what this is really getting at is, this is what you need to know. Okay, and so this is where you're meant to start. All right, and so, but that's just my theological idea. All right, I'm not saying that there's nothing else to anything, but this thing kind of lends itself to saying, look, here's the beginning, we're going to go from here onward, not from some other story onward. Okay, so, but that's just my theological 2 cents. Grammatically, there's nothing suggesting anything else. It's not impossible, but there's nothing suggesting it. So, that's Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. And I'll have some notes up on that in due time. And so, any other questions quickly before I wrap up? Okay. Well, shalom. Hope you enjoyed and understood that, and we'll see you next week.